2009 marked the beginning of an age of video games that we still live in. You could say we are nearing the end of it actually, since technology is now enabling new types of experiences, new methods of interaction, and so on. But at a fundamental level, we are, in 2018, just about in the same place we have been since 2009. At the global stage, 2009 was not a great year for a lot of people. Michael Jackson had died, bumming out a very large number of fans and people that sometimes listen to music in general. The swine flu replaced the bird flu as a thing to be afraid of, and it would remain that way for the next decade. The LHC ended testing and began full operation, seeking out the mysteries of the universe by smashing hamsters together, or so I'm told. I believe I forgot to mention the whole hubbub about this is gonna cause a black hole, we're all gonna die because some guy on TV said it, even though there was no actual possibility of that happening. Microsoft decided to start a search engine of its own called Bing that only Cortana uses these days. Kickstarter was launched, bringing the idea of crowdfunding quite often to the wrong people, but still being mostly a force for good. Bitcoin became a thing in 2009. People that started mining it back then and kept it now have more money than either of us will ever have, plus our descendants, or the next two generations put together. And of course, the consequences of the financial crash were still causing misery. Some people were told that they were to work for free for a while, since times were tough, and they'd get exposure anyway, and that's just as good as payment, right? Those people were dumb enough to actually do it for many months, until it broke them, and they became the cynical bastard that's been hosting shows on this channel for the past 3 years. But most importantly, 2009 was the year when our Lord and Savior Gabe Newell unleashed his power upon the world. His radiant splendor drenched the planet in light, and in the knowledge that at the end of each year there would be a Steam sale, and everyone would get whatever game they wanted for a price they could afford legally. This happening right after the economy went into the toilet. I'm not saying it saved gaming, but it was a major boost to video game sales that helped it bounce back in a way that many industries have yet to do so. That's not to say that Valve was all puppy dogs and rainbows that year, because they did release Left 4 Dead 2, a game that is fine on its own, but it completely invalidates the previous one launched just a year earlier. It really made people that bought the first one feel like they were wronged a bit, like they were used as test subjects for a sequel that would eventually contain everything that the first one had. Valve wouldn't make that same kind of mistake anytime soon. That's why it takes them 50 years to launch a game these days. The rest of the industry, however, was still doing what it does best. It was chasing trends. There were no fewer than 5 music rhythm games, a lot of them from the same series, released that year, and that's only the ones that I bothered counting. The market was saturated. The people had their fill, and now they wanted to move somewhere else. There would be a few other titles in this genre in the next coming years, but they would be rare and for the most part irrelevant. The genre's appeal in the mainstream had died, as many others had in the past years. Its time in the sun was over. The spotlight had moved on to something else. The industry was now chasing a new trend, that of motion controls. Since the Wii proved how easy that concept was for people to understand, how simple it was for millions upon millions of people to get and to buy it, Microsoft and Sony raced to make their own. Sony already had the groundwork for it ever since the iToy Play days, but it never really capitalized upon it. Its PlayStation Move solution wasn't impressive, but it worked. It wouldn't really shine until the VR days, but we'll leave that for the end of this age. The solution that Microsoft had come up with, however, was comically marketed at E3 with a presentation that showcased fake software, fake hardware, fake games, fake people playing them, and fake developers, with Peter Molyneux at the center. By the time it would get to market, this Project Natal would be little more than a non-functioning joke as a game device, though the 3D camera in it was actually quite good on its own and would have many applications that would actually function. And of course, there was the other trend that people were latching onto. At this point, Facebook had grown to the point where it was becoming the dominant social media platform. It effectively became what people understood as social media, surpassing the high fives, Friendsters, and MySpaces of yesteryear. All that was left was for something for people to do other than poke each other when they were there, and so came Facebook games, one of the biggest of them being Zynga's Farmville. For the most part, a totally worthless waste of time where you wouldn't really accomplish anything. You'd just go through the motions so that you could go through the motions again, with limited playtime expandable if you would pester your friends about it. Farmville was an incredibly influential and successful game, not just upon the Facebook game space but on mobile devices as well. Though in 2009, most developers would soon be busy copying what became the biggest success of its time in the mobile space, Angry Birds. A simple concept for a game, that of catapulting things into other things and seeing them fall down, paired with something that is often overlooked and what really makes a game successful: easily marketable characters. This is what turned Rovio Entertainment from a small company that tried over 50 times to make a game that would sell well into a juggernaut, a giant, a company that owned the hottest property on any mobile device, or pretty much any device, one that would be turned into a giant media phenomenon and into a horrible movie, much like all popular video game properties. It was a casual game that people really liked, and it was around that time that the concept of casual games really started hitting the spotlight, even though they had been here for ages. Even Tetris before it was what you could call a casual game. PopCap, creators of one of the most popular casual games up until then, Bejeweled, came out with Plants vs. Zombies, quite possibly the simplest tower defense game of its day, but paired with highly marketable characters and a very approachable design. It too became an overnight success, leading to even more people trying to chase that trend. And since it was all trends this year, there was one bubbling beneath the surface. Defense of the Ancients was a very popular Warcraft 3 map, much like many of the tower defense maps that had already been turned into games. And several companies were trying now to turn Dota into its own game. Three major ones appeared in 2009. Demigod was a game where you would control creatures of great size discrepancy on very visually creative battlefields like fighting in midair. Then there was Heroes of Newerth, which was a carbon copy of Dota with the names changed around. And there was League of Legends, which took out some of the fiddly busy work of Dota but kept just about everything else intact and still had its own spin on characters. Because Demigod was too different from what Dota looked like, it never really stood a chance. And since Heroes of Newerth was too similar, it didn't really go anywhere either. League of Legends, however, became the biggest game in its genre over the next few years, though technically it would become the biggest game in any genre, generating billions and billions of dollars. It would spur on an arms race, one that would end with many victims. So what was left beyond chasing trends? Well, Halo Wars, an RTS for the Xbox 360, was released, something that you didn't see quite often. Strategy games of this type usually did not really work on consoles, for many reasons, mostly control related and audience related as well. And this game was released after the studio that made it, and also made the Age of Empires series, was shut down. The people working on it were informed they'd be fired as soon as the game was done, months in advance. That's how the industry worked. Well, that and working 100 hours a week for no overtime compensation. And all this was after Microsoft had already spent around $90 million trying to make a Halo MMO at Ensemble and failing to do so. A big part of the industry had firmly entered the phase of trying to recapture its old glory. BioWare tried to recapture rekindle the old Baldur's Gate charm with Dragon Age Origins, and for the most part succeeded, though it was becoming a bit obvious they had taken a few cues from The Witcher and perhaps too much financial advice for Electronic Arts, once people started seeing how the DLC functioned. Torchlight was a game made by some of the people that created Diablo to be a new Diablo. Planet Mule was an attempt to make Mule anew. Capcom was releasing 2 Bionic Commando games 20 years after the original, the big budget one being kinda horrible and the 2D side-scrolling one being actually kind of okay. id Software was trying to revive Wolfenstein and never really managed to do so at the time, due to various reasons. Tropico 3 tried to pick up where Tropico 1 left off and did a good job of it, though some would call it mostly a remake instead of a sequel. Piranha Bytes was trying to make Gothic again without actually owning Gothic anymore, and thus came up with the excellent Risen. The people that used to make up Clover Studios were now at a company called Platinum Games and tried to make an even more outrageous combat game than God Hand was, and they came up with Bayonetta, one of the greatest entries in the spectacle fighter genre. Telltale tried to bring back Monkey Island with their own specific take on the idea as the episodic Tales of Monkey Island, with varying degrees of success. Demon's Souls built upon the foundation of Severance the Blade of Darkness and From Software's own King's Field, adding a perpetual death twist to it that made it a very rewarding game to play. And Radical Entertainment remade the Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction, but without the Hulk as the excellent prototype, though it was kind of funny it came out when it did, since Infamous on the PlayStation 3 was a bit similar and came out at the same time, though this too was a trend, that of making open world games, where you would go around collecting things and smashing things, and then again, remaking things or creating spiritual successors was in its own way a trend as well. None of these have stopped, they're still going, and they're profitable for the most part. Big budget blockbusters also kept coming, with Borderlands bringing the looter shooter idea to the forefront, but too late to be of any use to MMO shooters like Tabula Rasa that was shut down that year. Batman Arkham Asylum was hands down one of the best comic book based superhero games ever made, in spite of its weak combat component that would in itself generate a new trend. Assassin's Creed 2 actually fixed just about everything that was wrong with its predecessor, making for a very enjoyable open world game in a time when climbing on towers to reveal a map full of things you could do had not yet been so overplayed that it became known as Ubisoft Game The Game. Though the PC version of the game would be released with a whole lot of DRM, the company's CEO essentially calling most PC owners pirates and spending the next couple of years being proved wrong. Red Faction Guerrilla came along and showed everybody what open world destruction could actually be, even without physics or any other proprietary hardware needed. And a decade later, it is still not surpassed, some would say not even matched, in its glory. Mid-budget games were a bit harder to find these days, but we did get creations like Brutal Legend, which was a mix of strategy and action drenched in pure metal music style and sensibilities. Fallen Earth tried to turn the concept of Fallout into an MMO, and did so well enough for its time, though it wouldn't ever be really that popular. What really stood out this year was the surge of indie games. You had the lovely Machinarium, an adventure about a little robot that could, and did. You had the Daleks' Whispered World, one of the first adventure games they've made, and since then they have created quite a few, and most of them looked amazing, having 2D graphics in a world where everybody was moving to 3D. They were a beautiful callback to the golden age of the adventure genre. Then we had games like Echo Bazaar that brought browser-based storytelling to a whole new level in the depths of fallen London. I also believe that the first farm simulator came out this year, starting its own trend of farming simulators and mundane activity simulators. And Flower was, well, Flower, though exactly how indie it was considering it had been published by Sony may be a bit debatable. And also a little game called Minecraft came out in 2009. It didn't make big waves at first, was just a game where you would build blocks out of smaller blocks, but then it got a survival mode, where monsters showed up and suddenly all the block building had a purpose, a point, reason for existing, and pretty soon it would become immensely popular. And you would think that it would be the game of the year, but its time had not yet come. Minecraft still has a role to play in this, but the game that best fit the year 2009 was Farmville, a shallow, soulless, pointless game filled with microtransactions that inspired an industry to create shallow, soulless, pointless games filled with microtransactions. Everything became a Skinner box on mobile because of it. It proved that people would pay anything if they were bored enough and if the game was marketed well enough, or often enough, or was so insistent and so Machiavellic in the way it just sabotaged whatever fun they could have ever had by making them wait a bit and giving them the option to pay to skip that waiting period. Any attempt to revive city builders or tycoons on mobile on the upcoming tablets would be dead because of it. Mobile video game monetization would go in this direction, of games where you would only be able to do a handful of things until you ran out of energy and you would have to wait or pay up to access the whole game. It would be like this for the foreseeable future. This way, the game would seem like it had depth to it, that it had so much there just waiting for you if you would only be patient. When the truth was, you'll just be going through the motions and never achieve anything, never be challenged, never have any creativity or the ability to make something on your own. You would just do what the game told you when it told you you could do it. This was the future of gaming that Farmville ushered forth, with high profit margins and a lot of marketability. And that is why it is the game of 2009. And so we end another year. Next week, a cataclysm will change a world. Goodbye.